Everybody thinks they understand the deal with Sparta. We've all seen the movies, the ripped abs, the shiny shields, the king screaming about glory and freedom while his men hold the line against the darkness. But let me tell you that Hollywood version is nothing but a fairy tale dressed up in iron and propaganda. The real Sparta wasn't built on some noble idea of bravery. It was built on a dark, calculated breeding program that rivals the worst dystopias we see rising in 2026. We are talking about a state-run machine that usurped the authority of the Most High to decide who gets to live, who gets to mate, and who gets thrown off a cliff into the abyss before they even learn to walk. This isn't your typical war story, family. Not really. Yes, there were battles. Yes, blood was spilled on the ground. But the true demonic nature of Sparta didn't manifest when the swords were drawn. The real horror happened long before that. Behind closed doors, right in the bedrooms and the birthing rooms where life is supposed to be sacred. It happened in the cold, unfeeling hands of the so-called elders, inspecting a newborn's spine, checking its legs, judging its cry, deciding in mere seconds whether that child was worth keeping or if it should be discarded like trash. Every single boy who survived that initial inspection was not raised by a loving family. He was manufactured by the state. And every girl who survived that culling had one future waiting for her. She was to be a vessel to produce the next batch of soldiers or be deemed completely useless to the state apparatus. In this system, love was considered a defect. Mercy was looked at as a disease. Individuality, the unique spirit given by the Creator, was something to be hammered out of you before you even turned 7 years old. The warriors the world celebrates today weren't forged by courage or righteousness. They were forged by a system so brutal, so utterly godless, that it would make most modern people sick to their stomach if they truly comprehended it. We are looking at generations of selective pairing, state-approved reproduction, shared wives, stolen children, and a training program designed not to teach boys how to fight, but to completely erase who they were and replace it with a programming code the government could use. Tonight, we are going to tear this myth apart piece by piece and expose the roots of this beast system. From the moment a Spartan infant was held up for judgment through the organized trauma of their childhood, straight into the cold mathematics of their wicked breeding laws. We are going all the way to the final chapter, when the very machine Sparta built to make itself invincible became the exact thing that destroyed it. You see, the system that created perfect soldiers couldn't create a society that survives. You cannot build a future on death. And that inevitable collapse is the part of the story nobody wants to talk about. Before we go deeper into this truth, drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see where the remnant is watching from. And if this kind of uncensored history is what you've been looking for, make sure you subscribe now. You are locked in with the best dark history breakdown on the planet, where we don't shy away from the ugly truth. Sparta didn't rise from olive groves and philosophy circles. It rose from the ashes of conquest and brutal subjugation. Beneath that polished image of warrior excellence sat a terrifying reality that looks a lot like the plantation systems of history. The Spartans were actually outnumbered in their own land. The Helots enslaved farmers from Messenia and the surrounding territories did all the actual work. They planted the grain, they fed the army, and let me tell you, they despised their masters with every breath in their bodies. For every Spartan citizen walking the streets in pride, there were several helots in the fields, dreaming of the day the whole wicked system would burn to the ground. Every season was a threat to the ruling class. Every tremor in the ground, every whisper at a festival could be the match that lit a massive rebellion. So Sparta couldn't afford a single ounce of weakness. Not in its soldiers, not in its women, and certainly not in its babies. Fear was the driving force. Now, in places like Athens or Corinth, a marriage was a negotiation between families. Wealth mattered, reputation mattered, sometimes even love and human connection mattered. But in Sparta, none of that counted. The only question was genetics. The state didn't just permit marriages, they were engineering them like scientists. It engineered them. The goal wasn't happiness or a family unit, it was industrial output. Two strong bloodlines merged into one household meant one thing: better raw material for the front line. Young men lived in military barracks well into adulthood, kept far away from anything soft or domestic. Young women were trained like high-performance athletes, watched closely by the state, and measured constantly to ensure they were fit for breeding. Every union was evaluated against a single cold standard: Will this pairing produce a son who won't flinch when a Persian spear is aimed at his throat? That is why Spartan weddings horrified the rest of Greece. A groom didn't court his bride with gifts and poetry like a normal man. He married late, sometimes past 25, after years of sleeping on hard wooden planks with other soldiers. On the wedding night, the ritual was bizarre. The bride's head was shaved and her dress was stripped. She was made to look as masculine as possible, twisting the natural order. The husband would sneak into the room after dark, stay briefly to do the deed, and then vanish back to the barracks before sunrise. Greek historians found this absurd, but Sparta had done the math on human psychology. Keep contact rare, keep the carnal desire high. Every encounter becomes charged and purposeful for the state's goals. In their twisted minds, urgency produced stronger children. Comfort produced nothing but weakness. And if a husband couldn't deliver results, the system had a backup plan. If a man was too old, too ill, or simply unable to father children, the state didn't just shrug and move on. It intervened directly. A younger, healthier warrior would be selected to sleep with the man's wife to ensure production continued. This wasn't treated as a scandal or adultery. It was treated as a service to the state. The younger man was donating his strength to the nation. The older man kept his name, his home, and his status. The woman had absolutely no say in any of it. Her opinion wasn't part of the equation. Her body was viewed as infrastructure. Her womb was public property. Once a woman was pregnant, privacy disappeared entirely. Her belly wasn't a personal milestone or a blessing, it was an ongoing evaluation by the state. You have to understand that the surveillance state is not a new invention of 2026. Back then, the entire neighborhood acted as the eyes of the system, monitoring every calorie she consumed, every workout routine, and every private habit she formed. While the rest of the world tried to keep their women hidden and modest, the Spartan system flipped the script, forcing these women into the open to train like soldiers, throwing the javelin, sprinting until their lungs burned, and engaging in hand-to-hand grappling that would make the hypocritical leaders of other Greek cities gasp in horror. But you see, Sparta was never concerned with morality or modesty. They were obsessed with efficiency and results. The system believed that a muscular woman with wide, powerful hips was simply a better factory for production, ensuring a safer delivery, and in their twisted eugenics philosophy, creating a thicker, genetically superior infant. The spiritual boundary between being a free citizen and being used as a mere breeding instrument didn't just get blurry in this culture. It was completely erased, setting the stage for the kind of biological control we are seeing rise again in the modern world. On the surface, it looked like progress because a Spartan woman could hold the title to land, speak her mind in the public square, and even influence the political chessboard. But do not be deceived, every single one of those privileges was hanging by a single fragile hook. Her value was calculated solely by what her body could contribute to the military-industrial complex of that day. Then came the moment the child arrived. In almost every other culture in the ancient world, and indeed in the eyes of the Most High, childbirth is a sacred spiritual event. Usually the family would gather around, prayers of thanksgiving would go up to the heavens, and a spirit of relief would fill the room. But in Sparta, the first scream of a newborn baby wasn't a cause for celebration. Joy. It was the beginning of a cold bureaucratic audit. You have to realize that this baby did not belong to its mother or its father in the eyes of the law. That child was the property of the state. And just like the systems of control we warn against today, the state demanded immediate, tangible proof that this new life was worth the investment of food and resources. The infant was snatched up and carried to a public hall, likely the place known as the Lesh, where a council of stony-faced elders sat waiting in judgment. These men weren't healers, they weren't doctors, and they certainly weren't midwives with a heart of compassion. They were the supreme judges of life and death, and their verdict allowed for absolutely no appeal. They scrutinized the biological vessel with a cold eye, checking the symmetry of the limbs, the width of the chest cavity, and the power behind the cry. Some of the ancient records reveal a terrifying detail. The baby was not bathed in warm, cleansing water to soothe its spirit, but was submerged in undiluted wine. The theory was a primitive form of chemical testing, believing that a sickly or weak body would go into seizures or collapse under the shock of the alcohol. Whether this is literal history or a dramatized memory, the spirit behind it is undeniable. It is the principle that should haunt us in these last days. This was a society that absolutely refused to let nature or the creator take its course. It demanded visible physical proof of power and utility before a child was even a few days old, rejecting the weak to build a master race. If a baby looked solid, if it screamed with the rage of a warrior, it was handed back to the parents. But don't mistake this for a happy reunion. It was a sentencing. This one is allowed to live. And realize that this child's life script had already been written by the elite's total obedience, a life of pain and an eventual death in war. But if those elders saw something they didn't like, a crooked limb, a cry that sounded too weak, or a body that didn't fit their genetic template, the gavel came down and the verdict was final. The parents were programmed to accept this judgment without a single word of argument. The state claimed absolute godlike authority over who had the right to exist within its borders. In that moment, the child ceased to be a son or a daughter in the eyes of the system. It became a rejected product, a manufacturing error to be discarded. The ancient writers describe a place of horror called the Apathetes, a jagged, desolate gorge near Mount Taygetus. The infants deemed unworthy by the state were carried to this place of skull and bone and left there. The official government language called it exposure, a deceptive term meant to suggest they were letting the elements and the gods decide the fate of the child. But everybody knew what exposure really meant when you leave a newborn on bare rock in the freezing cold. It meant premeditated death. I want you to hold that image in your mind not as a Hollywood movie scene, but as a daily routine of a godless empire. Imagine the father walking down a dirt path toward the mountain of death, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth that barely stirs his heart, hardened by the indoctrination of his city. Think of the mother told to stay inside the house, or perhaps allowed to watch from a distance as her own flesh and blood disappears over the ridge, never to be seen again. Look at the neighbors who see this abomination happen and say absolutely nothing. Because in a totalitarian system, saying something means you are questioning the authority of the state. And we know, just as we see in the shifting culture of 2026, questioning the system means putting your own survival on the line. There was no trial, no funeral ceremony, no grave to visit, just the quiet demonic consensus that a body failing to match the blueprint has no right to breathe God's air. Over time, that consensus didn't even feel like cruelty to them. It began to feel like common sense, like necessary logic for the greater good. Showing compassion for the weak was treated as an act of treason and disloyalty to the strong. If you grieved too openly for the murdered innocent, you were identified as the problem. So the people stopped grieving to protect themselves. They changed the vocabulary to hide the sin. They said the baby was returned to nature, instead of admitting the ugly truth that they had killed their own child on the altar of the state. That silence, that suppression of truth, shaped the psychology of every single child who managed to survive the selection process. A Spartan boy grew up with a haunting knowledge in the back of his mind that he might have had brothers or sisters who never came home from that judgment hall. A Spartan girl might hear her mother's voice crack just once late at night, weeping over an infant she was forced to surrender to the beast system years ago. But these memories weren't allowed to breed empathy or love. They were weaponized to harden the heart. The message was, you are alive only because you were strong enough to survive the test. Do not waste this chance. Do not embarrass the state. From the moment a child could understand the spoken word, their existence was entirely conditional. Your right to live wasn't a gift from God or an inheritance. It was something you had to earn over and over again every single day of your life. Within this machine of war, women occupied a strange paradox. When you compare them to the women in Athens or Thebes, Spartan women appeared to have remarkable autonomy and power. They held deeds to property, they inherited vast wealth. They walked the streets freely without needing a male escort to watch over them. But listen closely, every one of those freedoms was just a leash dressed up as liberty. Their primary function, their only real purpose, was to manufacture the next generation of warriors. Their intense athletic training, the running the javelin, throwing the wrestling, none of that was for their own health or fulfillment. It was intense conditioning for brutal childbirth and the production of genetically superior offspring. Their glory did not belong to them. It was merely reflected glory from the state. A mother's highest honor in this twisted culture was a son who died fighting for the empire. A wife's greatest pride was a husband who came home dead on his shield. We have recorded words of Spartan mothers handing their sons a shield before they marched off to war, telling them cold-bloodedly, "Come back carrying this or be carried on it." Win or die. There was no third option for mercy or retreat. And you have to realize these mothers weren't just parents. They had been transformed into the ultimate enforcers of the state's will. They were the initial handlers, the very first phase of the programming. Long before the state agents kicked down the doors to snatch these young souls away at the tender age of 7, the mothers had already laid the concrete foundation of their indoctrination. You have to understand the bedtime rituals in these homes weren't about sparking imagination or filling a child's mind with wonder. No, these were psychological conditioning sessions telling tales of warriors who had completely killed their ability to feel pain. They drilled into them the terrifying fate of the cowards, men who were publicly broken, stripped naked, shaved bald like cattle, and paraded through the streets as living examples of what happens when you don't comply with the system. The most dangerous weapon these women wielded wasn't a physical spear or a javelin. It was psychological warfare. It was the crushing, unbearable weight of shame. If a young boy fell and dared to let a single tear drop, he didn't receive comfort. He felt the stinging rejection of his mother's disappointment, a spiritual wound that cut deeper than any blade and refused to heal. And the girls? If they showed a hint of softness instead of hardened grit, they were verbally lashed with sharp reminders that their only purpose was to be factories' vessels, expected to birth the next generation too. Now don't get it twisted, there was love in Spartan homes, but it was a twisted, cold affection forged in iron. Tenderness was never allowed to override the crushing expectations of the state. In fact, the love they offered only increased the pressure. This entire demonic structure was locked into place by the economy. Every so-called free citizen sat on a throne built on a plot of land worked by the enslaved helots who suffered in the dirt. That stolen labor is exactly what funded his seat at the communal table, his position in the war machine, and his right to speak in the assembly of the wicked. But you have to see the bigger picture. The land wasn't just about wealth or resources. It was another layer of the filtration system, a mechanism to weed out the weak. If your harvest failed, or your slaves revolted and fled, and you couldn't pay your dues to the communal pot, you were finished. The system chewed you up and spat you out, stripping you of your citizenship. You were instantly demoted to the status of an inferior, stripped of your vote, stripped of your rank, and completely stripped of your identity as a man. As the generations rolled on, more and more families fell through the cracks of that unforgiving floor. The standards never lowered, and the number of true elites kept shrinking as the system cannibalized its own. So, when we really break down what Sparta did to its own people, throwing babies off the cliff at Mount Taygetus was just the opening ceremony of their wickedness. The entire civilization was a 24/7 eugenics program, a filtration system running non-stop. It started with infant inspections to eliminate anyone who wasn't physically perfect. Then came the marriage policies designed to strictly control the bloodlines and eliminate anyone deemed genetically undesirable by the state's standards. Finally, the economic rules crushed anyone who couldn't keep up financially. With every passing generation, the circle of power got smaller, harder, and more isolated from the rest of humanity. They looked out at a world filled with slaves and rival nations, and they viewed themselves as a rare, pure alloy that had to be protected from contamination at any cost. They were so obsessed with this purity that they were willing to become so few in number that a single catastrophic battle could wipe their entire legacy off the face of the earth. Imagine the invisible spiritual weight packed into a Spartan childhood. Picture a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, running through the dust with the other kids. On the surface, he laughs, he plays, he wrestles. He looks like any other innocent child in ancient Greece living his life. But his spirit is unsettled because he hears things whispered, terrifying conversations about the infants who didn't pass the inspection and were discarded. He notices his father is a ghost in his own home, always at the barracks, never present. He sees the cold calculation in his mother's eyes when he stands up after a brutal fall without crying. That brief flash of approval means more to him than any hug ever could. And deep down he knows a massive shift is coming. Everyone has warned him. The prophecy over his life is clear. When he turns 7, the city is coming to collect him. He'll be ripped from his mother's arms and handed over to a pack of strangers. Nobody calls it kidnapping. They dress it up with words like education and honor. But we know it's systematic trauma. Even at 6 years old, he can feel the truth heavy in his chest. His entire world is about to be shattered, and he has absolutely no power to stop the machine. Listen, if you've made it this far through the breakdown of these breeding programs and the cold mathematics of a society that treated human beings like inventory, you aren't here for entertainment. You are watching this because you understand that real history, the truth they hide, is brutal and it doesn't flinch. This channel exists specifically for people like you, the remnant who are waking up to the patterns. We established a membership community called The Lineage for viewers who don't just consume these stories, but who want to stand in the gap and protect the truth. If you believe that dark history and the hidden things of the past deserve to be exposed with precision, depth, and zero compromise, then The Lineage is your tribe. It is exactly where you belong. Members get early access to the new investigation's exclusive content and the knowledge that they are the reason these stories aren't getting softened or censored for the algorithms. If that resonates with your spirit, get in there now. Let's keep moving forward. For the boys who managed to survive the flesh inspection, who made it past the silent judgment of the elders and the unspoken grief of parents, who sacrificed their own children, the next gate of hell waited at year 7. And when that gate swung open, childhood didn't just fade away, it was violently amputated. The officials arrived at the house to collect the boy like he was property. He wasn't enrolled in a school. He was collected and delivered straight into the jaws of the Agoge system. This was the training system that would spend the next 13 years dismantling everything human inside of him and replacing it with a cold tool the state could use for war. Mothers were programmed to watch their sons walk out the door without breaking down. Fathers stood by in silence, offering no objection to the theft of their lineage. The state's ownership of that child was absolute and non-negotiable. The boy walking out of his front door that morning had already cleared filters that would break most modern men. His physical body had passed the ruthless inspection at birth. His family had proven their obedience to the system by surrendering other infants who didn't measure up to the standard. His mother had spent years brainwashing him with stories about heroes who never wept and cowards who were destroyed, but all of that was just the entrance exam. The real demonic project of Sparta was only just beginning. And if you think what they did to the newborns was savage, wait until you see the horrors they inflicted on the 7-year-olds. We need to understand that this next phase wasn't just about testing the limits of the physical body. It was a calculated demonic assault designed for completely demolishing the mind. On the very morning a Spartan boy turned 7 years old, his entire reality was deleted. There was no grace period, no transition phase to help him adjust to the trauma. There was absolutely no easing into this nightmare. State officials showed up at the front door like grim reapers. The child was forced to walk out of his mother's house and straight into the iron grip of the state custody system. And that was it. The deal was sealed. From that specific breath forward, that boy didn't belong to his bloodline or his family anymore. He became the property of the Agoge, a brutal training apparatus designed with one singular dark purpose: to hollow out a child's soul and fill that empty space with blind, unquestioning obedience to the system. The warmth and innocence of his first 7 years, the soothing voice of his mother, the familiar smell of his home, all of it was severed deliberately like cutting a spiritual cord. You have to see the psychological warfare here. The system didn't just want him to ignore comfort. It wanted him to forget that comfort ever existed on this earth. These young boys were sorted into groups called agile, a Greek word that literally translates to herds. Now understand that translation wasn't trying to be poetic or metaphorical. It was chillingly precise. They viewed these children as livestock. Each group was placed under the heavy authority of an older youth, an Erin typically around 18 or 20 years old, backed up by adult supervisors like the paidonomos, which literally means the boy herder. These men weren't educators in any meaningful sense of the word. They were prison wardens. They decided when the boys slept, what they ate, who got beaten to a pulp, and who was allowed a fleeting moment of dignity. The entire architecture of this society was designed to do one specific thing, and we see this same spirit rising again in 2026. The goal was to destroy the idea that this child was a sovereign person with private thoughts and replace it with the understanding that he was just a cog, a component in a machine as kanti pulka. The first thing they stripped away was identity. Their hair was cut short, shaving away their individuality. Each boy received exactly one coarse cloak, and that single rag had to last the entire year. No sandals for their feet, no cushioned bed for their weary bodies. They walked barefoot through every brutal season, marching over sharp rocks, freezing frost and scorched earth, until the soles of their feet became as tough as leather. At night, they slept on rough mats stuffed with river reeds they had to gather themselves by hand. No blanket, no pillow. The cold wasn't a lack of resources or a budget issue. The suffering was the curriculum. If you shivered, you were expected to freeze without making a single sound. If you dared to mention the cold out loud, you just signaled to the whole group that you were breakable. And then there was the food, another weapon of control. The state didn't want satisfied, healthy children. It wanted desperate, hungry animals. Boys in the Agoge received just enough nutrition to function, but never enough to feel full. That perpetual gnawing hunger wasn't an oversight. It was the central mechanism of their programming. The instructors openly encouraged the boys to steal food whenever the opportunity arose. But this rule had a razor blade hidden inside it. If you were caught, you were whipped mercilessly. Not for the crime of stealing, but for the incompetence of being bad at it. The message was surgical and precise. Sparta rewarded cunning deceit and destroyed carelessness. There was absolutely no pity for the boy who got caught palming a loaf of bread. In the twisted eyes of the system, his suffering was his own fault for lacking the necessary skill to deceive. This single rule turned every waking hour into a predator's game. An unguarded plate, a basket of figs on a cart, a scrap of dried meat near a kitchen, it was all a test. Everything became a target, and the boys learned to watch each other just as closely as they watched their prey. Because if one was caught, the entire group could face collective punishment for failing to stop him or for not splitting the stolen goods. The Agoge used hunger as a weapon to force tactical thinking, but more insidiously, it was used to normalize betrayal among brothers. Your safest move was either to steal perfectly without a trace, or to let someone else take the risk and then join in the punishment when they failed. Helping the hungry was considered dangerous and subversive. Siding with the system against the unlucky was the only path to survival. Later Greek writers passed down sharp, haunting images from this demonic world. The most famous of these is the story of a boy and a stolen fox. A young Spartan conceals a live fox cub beneath his cloak to hide his theft. When the adults approach, he is too terrified to reveal the theft. The panicked animal begins tearing into his abdomen with its claws and teeth, eating him alive. The boy doesn't move, doesn't cry out, doesn't flinch. He stands perfectly still while the fox shreds him from the inside out until he drops dead. Whether this actually happened historically is almost beside the point. What matters is that Spartans told this story to their children as a model of excellence. They held this suicide up as the highest form of discipline, the willingness to die silently rather than admit weakness or expose the truth. From the outside, it reads as absolute madness. Inside Sparta, it was the gold standard of behavior. Speech was controlled with equal precision and brutality. Spartans became legendary across Greece for their clipped, brutal way of talking. The word laconic comes directly from Laconia, the region Sparta controlled. The Agoge drilled this style into boys from the start. Talking too much was seen as a massive liability. They were trained to hold their silence unless they could say something sharp, useful, or devastatingly efficient. During communal meals, adults would fire loaded questions at the boys to test their programming. What does courage mean? What is a citizen's duty? What do you think of this decree? A slow answer earned you humiliation. A stupid answer earned you a physical blow. An emotional answer earned you both. Over years of this trauma, boys learned to compress every thought into a handful of hard syllables and to say nothing at all when silence was safer than speech. The authority structure within the Agoge was not merely a chain of command. It was a carefully engineered pyramid of terror designed to distribute fear from the elite capstone all the way down to the foundation. While the Paidonomos and the adult overseers held the ultimate power to punish the boys for even the slightest infraction, they cunningly outsourced the dirty work of daily violence to the Irons. These were the older indoctrinated youths who had been activated and placed in absolute command of the younger, more vulnerable group, serving as the primary handlers for the next generation. These teenagers wielded an enormous unchecked amount of power with essentially zero accountability, creating a volatile environment where the whims of a compromised soul dictated the reality of the innocent. If an iron happened to be measured and fair, which was rare. The younger boys endured a harsh but survivable childhood. However, if that handler was cruel or possessed by a spirit of malice, those children lived in a state of perpetual grinding terror. The entire system was demonic in nature because it practically incentivized sadism, rewarding those who could shut off their empathy with positions of greater authority. Older boys who had spent years being humiliated, beaten, and broken often replicated that exact trauma-based programming on the ones beneath them, as violence was the only language of power they had ever been taught to speak. Inside this dark structure, you were left with only 3 distinct options for survival. You could be the designated victim who suffers relentlessly, or you could try to become invisible and fly under the radar. Or the most tragic path of all, you could choose to become the predator who inflicts suffering first, because in this beast system, there was absolutely no safe middle ground. Defending a weaker boy meant painting a massive target on your own back. Laughing when someone else was being punished became a survival mechanism, a dark signal of loyalty to the group and to the men running the program, proving you were one with the collective mind. The Agoge didn't just condition physical bodies for war. It was a psychological operation that rewired moral instincts at the deepest, most spiritual level. Kindness was viewed as a liability, and empathy became a dangerous vulnerability that could get you killed. In this twisted kingdom, loyalty flowed in only one direction. It flowed upward toward the state, and its brutal enforcers never downward toward the weak, or anyone who actually needed protection, mirroring the exact systems of control we see rising in 2026. A typical day was a grinding, soul-crushing cycle of monotony, high-level anxiety, and sudden explosive violence, where a boy might spend hours marching drilling formations or practicing grappling techniques until he collapsed. He might be forced to stand guard over supplies for endless hours, or run meaningless errands for his iron in total silence, breaking his will to resist. Then, with absolutely no warning, a supervisor might single him out, demanding an immediate answer to a complex political question, or accusing him of some invented failure just to induce psychological stress. The punishments were severe and demonic, ranging from brutal beatings to forced starvation and even public humiliation, designed to shatter the ego completely. And there were no clear boundaries or rules to follow. You could be punished for speaking, punished for remaining silent, punished for moving too slowly, or beaten for being too eager. It was a no-win scenario. The randomness was the entire point of the programming. When you can never predict what triggers the pain, you eventually stop trying to understand it and enter a state of dissociation. You simply accept the lie that you are always wrong. And once you accept that broken identity, total obedience becomes easier than critical thought. Religion was folded into this brutality, seamlessly using spiritual rituals to cement the trauma, and one of the most disturbing events took place at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. At this pagan altar, a block of cheese was placed as bait, a symbol of a prize to be won through blood and suffering. Groups of starving boys were ordered to rush forward and seize it, but standing between them and the altar were adults and older youths armed with heavy whips ready to strike. As the boys charged into the fray, they were lashed relentlessly, but the goal of the ritual wasn't actually to prevent them from reaching the cheese. It was a test to see who could absorb the most physical punishment and keep moving forward like a mindless drone. Some boys collapsed under the agony. Some screamed out in pain, while others stood silent as their skin split open and blood ran down their legs onto the cold stone floor, hardening their hearts in the process. What makes this ritual truly nightmarish and reminiscent of the days of Noah is the audience. Parents were expected to attend, not to intervene or protect, but simply to watch. Mothers and fathers stood on the sidelines as their own sons were beaten to the very edge of consciousness, participating in the trauma of their own lineage. And they were supposed to cheer, to shout encouragement to the abusers, and to demand that their child endure longer, effectively handing their children over to the state. They shouted for them to push harder and show no fear, because a boy who quit too early or screamed too loudly didn't just fail a test. He humiliated his entire bloodline in the eyes of the system. Consider deeply what that did to the spirits of both sides involved in this transaction. The child learned in the most visceral way possible that his parents would not save him, while the parents learned to override every God-given instinct to protect their child, choosing instead to celebrate the very system that was destroying him. The lesson hammered into these boys every hour of every day was absolute and total submission to the hierarchy. They were taught that your body is not yours, your pain is irrelevant, and your fear is a defect that must be purged. The only things that matter in this mindset are following orders, holding your position in the matrix, and never disgracing the state apparatus. And this deep-level conditioning didn't stop at physical endurance. It also completely restructured where emotional attachment was permitted to exist within the human soul. The Agoge actively cultivated intense, unnatural bonds between the older and younger males to replace the family unit. Some were framed as mentorships where an established citizen would take a particular boy under his guidance, oversee his development, and essentially act as his handler, and take personal pride in his progress, but in many cases, these relationships carried a dark sexual dimension. This was part of a pattern of institutionalized pederasty that existed elsewhere in Greece, but in Sparta it took on a distinctly military and strategic function. From the state's perspective, these attachments were strategic moves to sever the boy from his natural origins and graft him into the collective. They anchored the boy's identity not to his childhood home or his father's house, but to his comrades and to an older figure who embodied everything the Spartan state valued. An insult to the state became an insult to the person whose approval meant the most to him, fusing his emotional well-being with the survival of the regime. A failure of discipline wasn't just a risk of punishment, it was framed as a betrayal of the man he admired above all others, creating a trauma bond that is nearly impossible to break. The result was a total redirection of emotional need, love, pride, and the hunger for belonging away from God and family and straight into the jaws of the beast system. Everything was systematically engineered to sever the root connection to the biological family and graft the soul directly into the military-industrial complex. A young boy might harbor secret lingering emotions for his mother and father, but make no mistake they were no longer his moral compass or his center of gravity. The barracks became his temple, his home, and his god. By the time these young men hit their mid-teens, the indoctrinated products of the Agoge program were already operating as a high-functioning internal security apparatus. They were the eyes of the state, monitoring the younger generation, enforcing compliance and carrying out orders with robotic precision. They were paraded in public ceremonies, their callous, stone-carved faces serving as living, breathing propaganda for exactly what this beast system could manufacture when given total control. These weren't children playing war games. They trained with razor-sharp, lethal steel, not wooden toys. They were programmed to move as a single, terrifying hive mind, reacting to shouted commands instantly without a millisecond of hesitation or independent thought, and to chant the blood-curdling marching hymns that set the rhythmic heartbeat of a Spartan advance a frequency designed to instill terror. Their entire existence had been compressed into a traumatic, repetitive loop of mind control. Run until you vomit, drill until you bleed, eat barely enough to survive sleep in shifts and remain in a state of hypervigilance. There was absolutely zero margin left for a private thought, a quiet question about morality, or a single moment of genuine self-reflection or spiritual autonomy. Around the age of 20, a man supposedly became eligible for full admission into the adult warrior ranks. But let's be real, even then, his life was property of the state. He was still forced to consume every single meal at a communal table with his programmed peers. He could be blackballed and rejected from full citizenship if his mess group simply voted against him, effectively ending his life in that society. He might be legally married, but the state still demanded he sleep in the barracks, keeping him separated from the sanctity of the home. His wife, if he was assigned one, saw him only in stolen, fleeting moments, often creeping around after dark, like a stranger or a thief slipping through his own front door to avoid detection. The Agoge didn't end with a graduation ceremony and a pat on the back. It was a lifetime sentence that bled into every remaining year of a Spartan man's life, transforming his entire existence into an unbroken state of military readiness for the wars of the elite. By this stage in the programming, the fundamental transformation of the human soul was complete. The innocent boy who had once tightly clutched his mother's hand at age 7 was dead and gone. He was now a weaponized man who could watch his best friend bleed out beside him and not flinch an inch unless he was ordered to. He had been psychologically tortured for asking questions, physically punished for hesitating, and brutalized for showing anything that resembled human softness or empathy. Conversely, he had been rewarded for absolute silence, for calculating cruelty, and for charging headlong into the jaws of death without a second thought for his own survival. You can witness the final result of this trauma-based mind control at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans stood in a narrow pass and chose suicide over retreat. The history books call it superhuman courage. Their handlers and rulers called it proof that the programming worked exactly as the system designed it. Now, before we step into the darkest, most demonic chapter of that system, I need to pause and tell you something critical. The episode you are watching right now is built on a solid foundation of research, a primary source that dives deep into the horrific reality of Spartan training in childhood with a level of grit and detail that will haunt you long after you close the cover. That book, the absolute backbone of everything you are hearing tonight, is available right now through the View Products link on your screen. This is not some light casual beach reading for the weekend. It is a dense, unflinching examination of how a godless civilization can reshape human beings into something almost unrecognizable. If you want to understand the enemy's playbook deeper than any video could ever explain, that volume belongs in your library. And while you are browsing that tab, do not just stop at the main book. We have assembled a collection of critical themed pieces that connect directly to this world and the spiritual war we are in. These are immersive objects and rare historical memorabilia that pull you further into the era to understand the mindset of the time. The inventory rotates constantly, so I will not spoil what is available right now, but think of it as a private vault of items that let you carry a piece of this history into your own war room. You will also find our curated list, essential dark history books that every awakened individual should own, a hand-selected lineup of the works that shaped this platform from the ground up. Open the shelf, browse while you listen to the broadcast, and start building your own physical library of history's darkest chapters as we press forward into the year 2026. Because the agoge, as savage and demonic as it was still only the preparation phase for what was coming. Once a young man had survived the deliberate starvation, the beatings, the ritualistic whippings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, and the endless grinding repetition of combat drills, Sparta issued him one final terrifying assignment. And this mission crossed a moral line that nothing before it had ever touched. It was no longer about absorbing pain and trauma. It was about projecting that pain onto innocent people who could not defend themselves. The state took its most hardened, desensitized young men, armed them with knives, and released them into the countryside after dark like wolves. Their target wasn't a foreign army or an invading force. It was the helot population, the enslaved working class, who grew the food that kept the Spartan war machine alive. What unfolded in those fields under the cover of night was the final exam of their indoctrination. It was the moment where a human being was expected to murder without remorse, without hesitation, and return to base without a single crack in his emotional composure. That mission had a name. It was called the Cryptia, and it was the definitive moment Sparta stopped making soldiers and started creating something far more dangerous and sinister. The Cryptia was where Sparta stopped pretending to have any humanity left. Everything before this point, the starvation, the ritual whippings, the broken childhoods, all of it was just the warm-up. The Cryptia was the final Black Awakening. Every single year, the Ephos Sparta's most powerful occult magistrates issued an official declaration of war against their own slaves, the helots. Legally, it was a loophole formality to avoid blood guilt. In practice, it was a state-sanctioned hunting permit. The government handpicked its most hardened young killers. The sharpest, deadliest blades the agoge had produced armed them with nothing but daggers and the intent to kill and unleash them on the population. The ruling class dispatched their agents into the rural territories with a singular demonic agenda. Identify any member of the captive class who displayed the charisma or strength to spark a revolution and ensure he vanished from the face of the earth. These shadow operators did their dirty work under the cover of darkness, like thieves in the night. By day, they concealed themselves in trenches, behind ancient stonework and amidst the thickets bordering the farmlands waiting to strike. They were profiling the population, specifically looking for the men who carried the spirit of leadership. Those natural-born alphas who refused to break under the yoke of oppression. They observed who commanded respect among the brethren, who walked with their head held high, despite the chains, and whose physical stature screamed resistance rather than submission because their goal wasn't to arrest anyone. The objective was total extermination, no courtroom dramas, no opportunities for defense, and absolutely no witnesses left to tell the tale. If a brother spoke with too much conviction, or if his shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of a nation, or if his eyes burned with that undeniable fire of defiance, he was liable to disappear between sundown and sunup, leaving his family to wake up to a terrifying silence where a father and protector used to be. The only message the state left behind was the void itself a psychological weapon screaming, "Do not stand up, do not look us in the eye, and do not even dream of your liberation." Just stop and meditate on what that reality did to the psyche of an entire people living under the iron boot of the Spartan elite. These captives were already handing over the first fruits of their labor to feed their oppressors. They were already enduring ritualistic public shaming designed to strip them of their dignity and humanity. Historical records tell us they were forced to consume strong drink until they were stumbling, and sick solely so the Spartan youth could mock them and learn to despise the very image of the oppressed, but layered over that daily mockery was a silent, permanent spirit of terror. At any given moment in any season of the year, a demon in human form with a dagger could be lurking in the shadows right outside your dwelling. Judging whether your upright posture or your reputation in the community had signed your death warrant, you could never see it coming. There was no way to fight back against a ghost, and you couldn't even speak its name in public. This was state-sponsored terrorism woven into the very fabric of their daily survival. For the young oppressors holding the blades, this secret society was the final exam in a dehumanization process that began the moment they were snatched from their mothers at 7 years old. Now we know that taking a life in open warfare carries its own heavy burden, but at least there is a framework of combat to it. You are facing another armed combatant who is actively trying to end you, so there is a twisted sort of logic to the violence, however brutal it may be. But the targets of this secret war were not soldiers. They were farmers, walking home after a long day of toil, men sleeping in their own beds. People whose only crime was looking capable of greatness. To creep up behind an unsuspecting man and slice his throat requires a different level of darkness. The young Spartan had to completely extinguish that last flickering light of conscience within himself that screams, "This is murder." The government made it easy for them by rebranding this evil as civic duty and national security, brainwashing them to believe that hesitation was weakness and cold-blooded killing was the highest form of patriotism. By the time a man finished his rotation in these clandestine death squads, his internal moral compass had been completely rewired. The first body might have caused him to tremble, but the second one was much quieter on the soul. By the third kill, the applause from the elders and the validation from his peers had completely sanded down any jagged edges of guilt that might have remained. The entity that walked back into society was exactly what the Spartan state had spent 2 decades engineering in their laboratories of violence. A biological machine capable of delivering death on command without a second thought, without remorse, and without ever questioning if the order was righteous. That same psychological architecture that allowed a Spartan to hold the line at the Battle of Thermopylae and choose death over retreat was constructed in those dark fields upon the corpses of unarmed men who never stood a chance. This is the chapter of history that modern-day idolizers of this warrior culture conveniently gloss over when they try to emulate this spirit. They love to quote the catchy one-liners tattoo the symbols on their arms and post motivational memes about never surrendering to the enemy. But you almost never hear them talk about the covert death squads sent to butcher enslaved farmers in the middle of the night to keep the population in check. The truth is, you cannot separate the glory from the gore. The same paranoid fear of a slave rebellion, what we might call a black awakening today, that drove Sparta to turn its children into weapons, also drove it to commit systematic atrocities against the very people who put food on their tables. The perceived courage and the absolute cruelty grew from the exact same poisonous root. Celebrating one aspect while ignoring the bloodshed is not admiration, it is mythology. And for the surviving Spartan male adult life offered no escape from the beast system. Even after surviving the brutal training camps and the secret murder missions, there was no transition into a peaceful, normal life as we understand it. Until the age of 30, a man was mandated to live in the barracks and eat every single meal at a communal military mess hall. Being a member of one of these dining clubs wasn't a choice or a lifestyle option. It was the absolute foundation of his citizenship. Every man had to contribute a fixed quota of barley wine, cheese, figs, and meat from his estate. If his contribution came up short, whether due to a failed harvest, the loss of his laborers, or simply bad fortune, his so-called brothers would vote him out, and expulsion from the table meant being stripped of his citizen status entirely. So even in the years when there was no active war, the pressure was unrelenting. A man had to drive his slaves hard to keep his estate productive. He had to maintain a facade of flawless discipline in the public square and satisfy the critical judgment of his peers in every single interaction. He was constantly being evaluated, whether in combat or in casual conversation, measured by how he ate, how he trained, and how he carried himself in the silence. One serious stumble, one failure to perform, could eject him from the elite class permanently, leaving him with nothing. A system eerily similar to the one we see forming in 2026. Underneath that polished veneer of Spartan brotherhood and enforced equality, there was a spiritual rot, a constant grinding frequency of high-level anxiety that permeated every single aspect of their lives. It wasn't peace, it was a pressure cooker. The real question haunting every mind was, who is part of the system, and who is about to be purged? Who is the next target for elimination? You have to ask yourself, who is watching you right now? Because in that society, just like the surveillance state we see rising today, the eyes of the collective were always open. Even the sacred institution of marriage offered no sanctuary, no hiding place from the all-seeing eye of the state. It was a system designed to destroy privacy. Consider the unnatural programming they were under. Most men were forced to delay marriage until late in life, and even after the covenant was made, the state forbade them from living with their wives until they hit the age of 30. Think about that delayed maturity and state-controlled separation. Until that state-approved age, a husband had to sneak out of the military barracks, like a thief in the night, creeping back to his own house to visit his wife, as if he were an intruder in his own life. The children born from these brief, furtive encounters weren't products of a stable home. They were the result of a system that criminalized normal family intimacy. But we need to understand the darker agenda here. The deepest emotional connection, the soul tie in a Spartan man's life, was never intended to be with his wife. And it certainly wasn't supposed to be with his children. The system was designed to sever those natural bonds before they could even form. His loyalty was engineered to be solely with his brothers in the mess hall, the hive mind. The state spent his entire existence from the cradle to the grave, trauma bonding him to the collective to ensure the nuclear family never took precedence over the military-industrial complex of the day. And for those who tried to opt out, men who refused to marry faced open state-sanctioned punishment. In a beast system that viewed reproduction merely as a civic obligation to produce bodies for the meat grinder, remaining a bachelor wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was an act of rebellion. It was treated as sabotage against the state. It was considered treason against the survival of the regime. They viewed non-compliance as a direct threat to their power structure, much like how modern dissenters are labeled today. The humiliation rituals were demonic in nature. Unmarried men could be dragged into the public square, stripped of their dignity, and forced to walk through the city in the freezing dead of winter, without clothing, singing songs that mocked their own existence. It was a psychological operation designed to break the will. They weaponized the youth against the old. Younger citizens were actually encouraged, programmed really to mock these men, to physically strike them, and to jeer at them in the streets. The lesson was blunt, brutal, and incredibly effective at enforcing conformity through social terror. The message was clear. If you will not produce offspring for the state to use, you are a parasite. You are useless to the collective, and we will make sure you feel the shame of it deep in your bones until you break. It was the ultimate form of cancel culture before the term even existed. And the women, they carried their own version of this heavy, demonic yoke into every single year of their adult lives. The spirit of the age did not spare the mothers. It corrupted them too. The same culture that granted them what looked like progressive freedoms, unusual property ownership, public speech, physical independence, was just a golden cage. It was a bribe to get them to buy into a system that ultimately hated them. It reduced the value of a woman to a single cold metric, the biological quality of the sons she delivered for the war machine. She was a factory for the state, nothing more. Her worth was tied to her production capacity. A woman whose sons died gloriously in battle could walk through the city with her head held high, celebrated by the death cult. But a woman whose sons showed the slightest hesitation or self-preservation, she could be erased from social life overnight, treated like a leper. Many of the famous heroic sayings attributed to Spartan mothers are actually chilling evidence of a society without natural affection, mothers publicly disowning or shaming their own flesh and blood for failing to meet the impossible standards of the elite. This is what happens when the state becomes God. Whether every historical quote is 100% precise matters less than the spirit behind them. They reveal a culture where political ideology had completely overridden maternal instinct. A Spartan mother was expected to love the state so fiercely that she would rather see her son carried home dead on a shield than watch him live a long life if it meant being labeled a coward. It was a death worship that masqueraded as patriotism. For a handful of generations, this merciless blueprint appeared to work. It looked like success. The world looked on in awe, just as people marvel at efficient tyrannies today. Spartan armies earned a fearsome reputation as the most formidable infantry force in Greece. They were the super soldiers of the ancient world, programmed for war and disconnected from empathy. They dominated the Peloponnese with an iron fist. They projected power and fear, silencing opposition through sheer force and the threat of total annihilation. At Thermopylae, King Leonidas and a small contingent held back the Persian globalist advance for days in a narrow corridor. Their sacrifice became legendary, a story told to justify the system, even earning the grudging respect of their rivals. Later, during the long, grinding attrition of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta eventually brought the great intellectual hub of Athens to its knees. But remember, they did it with Persian gold, tipping the scales, foreign money backing the war effort, and claimed supremacy over the Greek mainland. From the outside looking in, the equation seemed simple, it seemed logical. The world believed the lie that strength comes from cruelty. They thought the harshest system produced the best soldiers, and the best soldiers always won. But behind the victories, behind the propaganda, the structure was eating itself alive like a cancer. The beast was consuming its own tail. The most fundamental crisis was demographic, a warning we should be heeding in 2026. The very standards that define their identity. Strict citizenship requirements. The obsession with purity became their downfall. The brutal infant selection programs, the constant exposure to endless combat, the eugenics mindset, these things were systematically reducing the number of people who actually qualified as citizens. They were breeding themselves out of existence. You couldn't hold status unless both parents were pure-blood Spartiates, and you maintained an equal land allotment worked by slave labor. It was an impossible standard to maintain over time. Over the decades, wealth began to concentrate into fewer and fewer hands. The middle class was hollowed out, leaving only the ultra-rich and the desperate, a pattern we are seeing repeat right now. Citizens who fell into debt or lost their plots didn't just lose money, they lost their humanity in the eyes of the state. They slid into lower classes, stripped of political rights, becoming ghosts in their own city. Births that cleared every genetic and social filter became increasingly rare. Battlefield deaths, natural disasters, and disease carved away at what little remained of the population. The judgment of barrenness had set in. By the 4th century BC, Greek writers were already sounding the alarm using the term oliganthropia, a critical shortage of manpower. The nation was literally running out of men. At its absolute peak, Sparta may have counted several thousand full citizens, a tiny elite ruling over a massive slave population. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra, estimates suggest barely 1,000 remained, possibly even fewer. The elite class had decimated itself through its own arrogance. Every soldier killed in action now left a gap that couldn't be filled. Every stillbirth, every infant thrown off a cliff for failing inspection, every family that lost its land, it all shrank the pool further. The death culture was reaping what it sowed. The machine designed to produce only the elite had succeeded so thoroughly that it was running out of people to operate the gears. It's a perfect picture of how evil eventually collapses under its own weight. And then, as often happens when a nation turns from the natural order, a catastrophe exposed the fragility for everyone to see. The judgment came suddenly. The earthquake of 464 BC hit like the wrath of God. A massive tremor tore through Laconia, leveling their military buildings and killing an unknown number of Spartans in an instant. The unshakable city was shaken. The Helots, the slave class, who had spent generations waiting, watching, and praying for exactly this kind of moment, saw their window. They launched a full-scale rebellion centered in Messenia. It was the Black Awakening of the ancient world, the underclass rising up. For a terrifying stretch of time, it looked like Sparta might be swallowed whole by the very population it had terrorized and abused for centuries. The fear shifted from the slaves to the masters. The city was forced to do something unthinkable, something that shattered their pride. They had to beg for outside help. They called on allies, including Athens, the very city they would later try to destroy, to help them crush the uprising. They needed their enemies to save them from their victims. That request alone was a crack in the foundation that could never be repaired. The illusion of invincibility was gone. The so-called invincible state could no longer control its own enslaved workforce without globalist assistance. Yet in their pride, Sparta refused to adapt. They kept the helot system. They refused to repent. They kept the agoge indoctrination camps. They kept the rigid citizenship laws that were killing them. When the pressure mounted and the writing was on the wall, they didn't innovate. They doubled down on their own destruction. Does that sound familiar to you? They doubled down on their traditions, locking themselves into a spiritual stronghold of pride that finally reached its breaking point at the Battle of Leuctra in the year 371 BC. The Theban general Epaminondas stood face to face with a Spartan-led force that was operating under a strong delusion, believing in their core that they were untouchable and invincible in open combat. The Spartans deployed their standard military formation, the same old ritualistic patterns they had used for generations, without ever questioning if the season had changed. You had the king and his elite warriors positioned on the right wing, the phalanx moving forward in that time-tested rhythm that had secured 100 victories, but Epaminondas refused to play by their rules or bow to their system. He massed his most powerful fighters on his left flank, creating an unusually deep column of spiritual and physical force aimed directly at the head of the serpent, the Spartan elite. At the same time, he deliberately held back other sections of his line, creating a trap. When the collision finally happened, it was absolutely devastating to the old order. That concentrated Theban left wing smashed into the Spartan right with a weight of glory and force that the traditional formation simply could not absorb. King Cleombrotus fell and the head was cut off. The legendary battle line, forged by generations of suffering discipline and man-made strength, broke apart completely under a new tactic it had never been trained to answer. When that right wing collapsed, the rest of the army unraveled right along with it, because Leuctra wasn't just a military defeat on a battlefield. It was the total destruction of an ideology, the shattering of a mindset that had exalted itself above knowledge and adaptation. It proved that a system built on perfecting one single approach, repeating it endlessly like a religious ritual and refusing to question it, could be dismantled by an opponent willing to think differently and move in a new way. The aftermath was catastrophic for the establishment. Thebes and its allies didn't just win a battle, they invaded the Peloponnese and struck at the root. They marched straight into Messenia and liberated the Helot population, establishing an independent Messenian state and breaking the chains of generational slavery that had fueled the empire. The land that had sustained Sparta for centuries, the fields worked by generations of enslaved laborers whose cries had reached the heavens, was severed from them permanently. Without that economic foundation built on oppression, the citizen body contracted even faster, proving that you cannot build a sustainable kingdom on the backs of the broken. Sparta continued to exist on the map, but its era as a dominant power was finished. Everything it had built rested on two pillars, a captive labor force and a narrow core of elite warriors, and both were crumbling. Once the laborers were freed by the awakening and the warriors were cut down by the judgment of war, the illusion faded. There was nothing left to project strength or intimidate the nations. Later Spartan kings like Agis IV and Cleomenes III recognized the decay and attempted radical reform to save the ship. They saw the diagnosis clearly. With open eyes, too few citizens, too much land hoarded by a greedy few families, and too much comfort corroding what remained of the old austerity. They proposed land redistribution and debt cancellation, trying to hit the reset button on the inequality that was rotting their society from the inside out. They called for a restoration of the ancient training, and some even tried to implement these changes by force, hoping to turn back the clock. But every single attempt collided with demonic resistance from the wealthy families who had profited most from the inequality and refused to let go of their mammon. Spartan society had calcified beyond repair. The same inflexibility and hardness of heart that once made it terrifying now made it incapable of saving itself from destruction. By the time Rome absorbed Greece, Sparta had become its own ghost, a shadow of a former glory that had long since departed. It no longer shaped the destiny of nations or terrified its enemies. Instead, it monetized its history, selling its heritage for a paycheck, while Roman tourists traveled to Laconia to witness reenactments. They came to see boys flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia, and youths marching in formation, turning their solemn traditions into a sideshow for the Gentiles. Displays of endurance and stoic silence, the rituals that had once served a lethal military purpose were now just performances staged for foreign audiences with deep pockets. The city that had made the ancient world tremble had become a living museum of its own brutality, a theme park of pain. They were literally charging admission to watch their own children bleed. That final transformation is the most telling and prophetic detail of the entire story. A civilization that tried to engineer flawless warriors ended up as a theatrical set performing its own cruelty for coins and applause, selling its soul for relevance. The boys still bled under the lash, the pain was still real, and the blood still hit the ground. But those blows no longer defended an empire or stood for a cause. They entertained visitors, and behind the spectacle, the population was a fraction of what it had been. Wealth was concentrated in a handful of estates while the people starved, and real power existed somewhere far away, leaving them hollowed out. Sparta had won countless battles in the natural, but it had lost the only war that ultimately mattered, the spiritual war against its own obsolescence and arrogance. So what does this story actually teach us in 2026? It is not the bumper sticker version about toughness, grinding, and never giving up. The Spartan system did produce human beings who could stare down a charging army and refuse to take a single step backward, showing immense fortitude. It produced phrases so sharp and witty that they are still quoted 2.5 millennia later by people who don't understand the context. But it achieved all of that by treating people as raw material to be inspected, shaped, and manipulated for the benefit of the state. They were discarded when they didn't meet specifications. It was a system that killed newborns who failed a visual exam, forcing a culture of death from the cradle. It starved and brutalized children, as official policy, turning young men into covert assassins of the enslaved people who fed them, creating a cycle of violence. It traded every form of adaptability and humanity for a single narrow definition of excellence, and eventually that trade destroyed them completely. A society optimized for one style of warfare and one way of thinking couldn't survive when the world changed around it and the judgment came. A ruling class that shrank with every generation because of its own exclusivity couldn't hold power over a majority forever. The awakening was inevitable. A state that punished curiosity and independent thought eliminated the very qualities that might have allowed it to evolve. Sparta didn't collapse just because it was weak. It collapsed because it made itself so rigid, so proud, and so unyielding that the first real shock from the outside shattered it completely into dust. When we look around at the confusion of 2026 and see folks worshipping the image of Sparta, what we are really witnessing is a deep spiritual anxiety manifesting in the flesh. It is a profound terror of the chaos in the streets, a fear of weakness in high places, and a desperate craving for a world of ironclad laws and boundaries that cannot be shaken. To the unawakened mind, Sparta looks like the ultimate antidote, a promised land where every single soul has a defined purpose and a role in the grand design. A militaristic utopia where every threat is met with cold, absolute resolve, and where the spirit of hesitation is crushed before it can even take a breath. But we have to look at the receipts, because the actual price of that fantasy was paid in the blood of the innocent. It was a demonic nightmare that consumed its own seed and burned itself into the dust of history in just a few short generations. The revelation is clear for those with eyes to see. You cannot build a righteous order by treating God's children like cattle to be bred, inspected, and slaughtered at the will of the state. You might construct a terrifying beast of a war machine that dominates the physical realm for a season, but you will never establish a civilization that holds the favor of the Most High or lasts through the ages. And you will never create a reality that anyone with a living conscience or a righteous spirit would ever choose to call home. If you are still vibrating with me at the end of this message, realize that you are part of the remnant, that rare 5%. The masses flee when the truth gets heavy, but you stood your ground, and that signifies that your spirit is awake. Make sure you crush that subscribe button and hit the like right now. We have to force this deep, unfiltered knowledge through the algorithm so it reaches the people who are finally ready to wake up from the slumber. Forward this broadcast to that friend who is still posting those Spartan warrior memes, completely ignorant of the slavery and suffering that foundation was built upon. Help them break the programming and see the complete, unvarnished picture of history before it repeats itself. This is the source for the real hidden history that the establishment does not want you to know.